Well, welcome to our webinar, Deconstructing Agentic AI. I'm Tom Reuner, Principal Analyst with PSC. I'm delighted to have my esteemed colleague, Spencer Izard. Spencer, warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Tom. Good to see you as always virtually. And I look forward to us actually having a slightly different format today and actually I would consider maybe a little bit more human in our conversation rather than
Absolutely,
some
absolutely.
of the presentation stuff. So
I
I
couldn't, I
think,
couldn't agree more. We don't see each other often enough, so that's for sure. Great, let's get into it. So why did we choose that title? And it's very simply. On the one hand, how do we cut through the market noise? It's difficult to get heard to start with, but then also to make sense of all that noise. And the second point, and it's sort of intertwined with the first point, literally how do we understand all the suggestion of disruption? A good example takes Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. He suggested pretty much SaaS, software as a service, is dead. This will be replaced by agentic. Otherwise, if you look at some of our analyst brethren, they're suggesting there's a pivot of service as software, almost towards service as software. And the point here is, over time, we're seeing labor arbitrage, which is literally the key element of everything of service or everything Spencer and I spend most of our time on, towards technology arbitrage. What does it really mean? And a good example is if you listen to somebody like Accenture, and Accenture are pretty much a benchmark for thought leadership around those issues, especially around transformation and innovation. And then one of their seminal pieces, which are called Technology Vision, which is almost published early in every year, they're suggesting that by 2030, that's 5 years time, so not far out, a piece of technology, largely agentic or at least AI, will be the primary way of consuming service, at least internally, not just externally, but at least within the organization. So a lot to get through, and I need some of Spencer's brain to keep us grounded. Before we jump into that, a short householding note. We would love to hear your questions. You will hear enough from us, but we'd love to hear your questions. So you see the Q&A button on the bottom. Please go through. So we devote enough time. Also happy where we don't get to all the questions. Happy to follow up. So please make use of it. Without further ado, Spencer, having said all that, but almost also keeping in mind, many organizations still work with mainframes, Lotus noise, loads still alive and kicking. So how shall we think about the whole topic agentic? Keep us grounded. What are you hearing?
I mean, look, in all honesty, we're in that sort of honeymoon phase, as the cliches go. I'm cautious that I might sound like an English football manager by some of the sort of cliches that you come out in this kind of conversation, but we're in that early discovery phase, to be honest with you. And we've got a whole industry, tech industry, that has realized that this is for them the next big wave of potential for them to drive their businesses forward. So they're obviously understandably trying to push marketing messaging and other types of messaging out into the zeitgeist to get people to understand and connect with it. I think where we're at the moment is there's a lot of hype, a lot of understanding, but what there isn't so much at the moment is a lot of actual tangible business use cases. And we've definitely nowhere near yet at the stage where we're, fully decomposing or deconstructing, I should say, as the title of the session. We're not fully yet deconstructing the real value part of the organization, which is, the deep business workflows and operating models. We're in that kind of, early stage experimentation. Now, the issue with the early stage experimentation, of course, is that, who goes first? There's a lot of cautiousness
Yeah.
on the buyer side. I mean, when I was on the buyer side, yeah, honestly, you would look at these things, you might run an odd POC, but you're going to wait and see, who's coming out with something that looks like it's a not just a credible service and a credible technology, but something that really resonates with a challenge in my industry. I mean, how are you sort of seeing some of this?
Well, no, I think first, or use more my question before some of turn around. How would you almost guide our audience? I think the key thing is it sounds like literally software robots are taking care of activities typically humans do. How much agencies and how much automation actually is there in your view?
I mean, look, so I've had the fortune and some of the pain and the scars to work on the buyer side of things, and look, I would say over the last, if we be kind and say, look, the cloud really sort of took off around 2012. During that period of time, robotic process automation sort of exploded onto the scene as a form of, in my career so far, of like almost 3 decades of career, automation in some form or another, or integration, has always been at the heart of every company I've either worked for, advised, or worked with. So we're at this stage right now where organizations are trying to work out, where's the value conversation for them. How do they translate that value into, the idea of value into a tangible project and a goal? How much risk is involved with the adoption, of these type of technologies? I mean, it's one of these things where, actually, I'll give you an example. I was talking to a friend of mine who works for a relatively small, medium-sized hedge fund, and back in 2012, he's been there for quite some time. Back in 2012, we were talking about cloud. And one of the things he said about cloud for his organization back then, which was a lot smaller, was it was a great equalizer for them, because he'd come from a large bank to join the hedge fund. And at that large bank, they had lots of data centers, lots of grid computing, lots of stuff at the time to do Monte Carlo, everything, all the simulations they wanted. A medium-sized company just wouldn't be able to afford the footprint needed at that point. Cloud came along and access to compute services, and it became more of an equalizer for small to middle companies. And he was saying something I was thinking about as well, which is that for them, the potential for fully autonomous human-like
Yeah.
decision making is the next differentiator for them, because it allows them to operate at a scale that they, for their size of company, they previously potentially wouldn't be able to operate at. And they're looking at it at the moment very much as a sort of a research assistant type, not a co-pilot type thing, but more detailed than that, but more of a sort of research assistant, gathering basic decision making assistant that allows them to, without having to employ a lot more humans, to scale appropriately. So I think at the moment we're in that definite exploratory phase where some organizations see the potential. A lot of the software companies are focusing more around on where their agentic AI fits best into their suite. So if you look at someone like ServiceNow is doing really great work around their CSM side of their business as well, because that's an easy, obvious, not easy, sorry, but it's a very open, obvious opportunity to improve. Salesforce is obviously doing a lot in pushing the space. So everybody's sort of picking at things. What we're not seeing at the moment, though, is more complicated, multi-AI, complex business workflow deconstruction. But I don't know about for yourself.
No, great observation. I'm not shying away from your question. And I think there are probably many lenses to which some of them are to look through the topic and trying to tackle it. And just one more, the obvious, just what a difference a year make. If you
Yeah.
count
Okay.
memories a year back, you're
Okay.
talking about generative AI and people got even frightened by generative AI. Now we
Yeah.
move everything to the next high point, as you mentioned, agentic. People are getting more frightened, but almost just staying with the frightened a little bit. We're just
Yeah.
scratching the surface on AI, quite frankly. If people are frightened about job replacement change, we haven't seen as anything serious as yet. The fundamental shift, what AI is, all the points you just rightfully called out, the way we should think about agency automation around that, that will change so much more, but not with the current set of algorithms. And that's probably almost, if I talk like this and listen to you, almost you have a similar view on that. I think we're so early on that development on one hand. But I think the frightening or somewhat encouraging bit, some of the innovation cycles are so compressed. But not only that, but even some of the way organizations look at that, how much change there is. Because what we are seeing is you called out cloud. I think it took us more than 10 years just to make sense. Many organizations still struggle to achieve the
Really.
strategic objectives. In the end, it's the holy trinity as cloud, data, and AI. So if you talk about AI, we have to think, we do our homeworks on all those things. But then again, some of them, if we're moving forward, I think we have to flip it on its head. I think in the end, the key thing, I don't think where the industry and including even people like Accenture typically come out, they're really good thinking ahead, not talking about technology capabilities, but talking about what does it really mean transformation to organization. They're quite a grown-up way, but for AI, even they're early. So they're talking up aspirations, capabilities. So what we have to do, I think what the missing piece is, but that's also a point to how early we are with those discussions. What's the literally operating model for AI? How shall we think around that? How we think about talent? And I think until we really figure that one out, I think we can't progress properly or it will be siloed, small pilots, productivity centric, but the transformation then has always be alignment with business goals, business objectives. What's
Yeah, I mean, if I can lead, I think that's a really good point. I mean, and lead on there for you from that as well. I mean, like I would say right now, if I was back on the buyer side of things, doing a sort of enterprise architecture, CIO type role, you know, I would be looking at this from a few angles. And I think you touched on some of them there, Tom. Is that to adopt something like agentic as a form, if we look at the other forms of AI before this point, and you touch generative AI, so machine learning, varying type of natural language processing, all of these things were very technical for very specific use cases. Machine learning grew in automation. They weren't so much change agents, and I don't mean agents in the agentic term, I just meant in the phrase term. They weren't so much change agents as enhancers of existing capability. Agentic has the potential to be a fundamental business behavior change agent, which then means it falls into a very painful, complicated trap from, especially when I used to manage software and manage IT functions, which is and you touched on it. We're in a human conversation, so we've got to identify parts of our business that are currently performed by a person that could be candidates for autonomous decision making. We've also then got to understand what people's goals and targets are, organizational structure, cultural styles and preferences, because culture and style changes a lot by country. Then there's governance, internal governance in the organization, and external regulatory and compliance. These are all very interwoven, complex soft skill elements. I mean, and one of the things I would say with this is a technology, if there ever was one, where the conversation needs to start. If we look at it from the private sector perspective for a sec,
yeah,
I would say the conversation needs to start in the corporate strategy teams within organizations, corporate strategy teams who are looking at what external forces are impacting our company, how we then need to drive revenue, optimize, cost optimization, all this kind of stuff to advise the CEO to be an overall strategy. This technology sits as a conversation point in that department, because you need to understand where are the operational targets in your business against the industry goals that you have to get the value out of it. And I think and we're in a point where if I was building a strategy around AI right now, depending on the cultural appetite, should we say, of my company that I was working for, we should be considering that some companies are going to go now, going to go immediate. But in reality, a lot aren't. So what you're looking at developing is not an AI strategy for going now, but what you would call like an inevitability strategy, which is, okay, what would be the market conditions for us, our company and our industry, where the true use and adoption, the value of agentic AI would be a differentiator. And you need to basically put the warning signals into your strategy. You then need to use, if you decide, well, actually, it's going to be about a year before we can, really start to get value out of it. That's your time to start to skill up internally, start to think about restructuring, engage with service providers to work out what the deltas and the gaps would be. It's almost like don't rush into trying to do it now. You do need to build yourself that, well, again, cliche time, but you do need to build yourself a runway. Or the other even worse cliche, you're building your plane while you're trying to land it. But yeah, it is that kind of cycle we're
I'm
in.
tempted to call it marketing alert. It's almost you're quite close to that one. So
Exactly. But
but
but all
still,
serious.
what are the missing pieces to progress? If I listen to you, where we could head or should head over time, what are the missing pieces? But also looking at some of the questions coming in, and we will get to those in a moment. If I look out, I think for me, the elephant in the room, always when we discuss innovations like AI, we tempted to look at almost cloud native or even the next generation AI native organization.
Yeah.
Haven't seen many demos, quite frankly,
Oh,
but demos we have to see, and I think that's the elephant in the room. Organization must process that, technology that, and culture that, because it's not about if you sit on a modern stack. Of
yeah.
course, we can extend to the next innovation, whatever that innovation is. But typically, some of the really clients we have to focus on. Think about the banks sitting on
Mm,
so much technology that you've been there, you
absolutely.
advise them. So the convoluted commentary, but also questions of what are the missing pieces that we have to address as an industry to make that progress you're talking about.
I mean, look, and I think in relating to that, and I think I saw something pop up on the message, somebody asking about the signals. Um, for me, there's always a few things, and this isn't particularly to agentic AI, it's in general, but I would suggest in the agentic AI context is it's a great initial value as a triaging support mechanism. If there are parts of your business or parts of a client that you recognize in their business that are being overwhelmed with the sheer amount of workload they're having to deal with, and throwing people at it at scale and training them up and managing that is not necessarily going to help. I'll give you an example, would be something like risk and fraud detection within financial services, the same with
Yeah.
insurance and dealing with policies as well, where irrespective of all the goodwill in the world, this is the digital transformation coming home to nest conversation, which is we've just spent the last 15 years digitally transforming, which means we've created all these interfaces, all these systems, massive amounts of data. In the analytics world, they talk about all the V's, velocity and volume and all of this. So we've just got all of this out there now. And most departments, whether they're in a finance firm, whether a retailer dealing with customer service, are just overwhelmed in every single direction. Marketeers, signal marketeers are stressed in most organizations I speak with because the amount of expectation for volume of engagement they have to do, the ever sort of white whale of hyper personalization, which I think with agentic we've actually got something that can get there. All of these things are putting pressure, and it's a scale problem. And so in these organizations, so whether you're a service provider, software firm, or if you're on this webinar, an enterprise, or wherever you are, identify the parts of your business, like I say, risk and fraud detection in a bank or something like that, where it's an essential core service, it's overwhelmed, and there's a conversation to be had about this from a triaging mechanism. That's a good gateway in. And the other thing to bring up, I mean, you and I have been around this for long enough, Tom, is obviously we both look incredibly youthful. I'm not insinuating we're too old. But
Go on, Joe, go on.
yeah, but we've been around this a while. And I would say is that there's also an adoption comfort zone. Again, if I go back to the sort of CIO-ish work, I'm not going to just adopt agentic AI like that. I'm going to need certain use cases, or more importantly, if risk and fraud detection, I'm going to turn it on gradually to build faith in it and trust in it. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of hype also. When you were talking about a year's difference, couldn't agree more. And in this year, the hype isn't so much talking about an agent, it's multi-agent communication. And it's like, yes, that's an inevitability. However, there is a lot of risk related to that. There's a lot of unprovenness related to that. And there's a lot of security issues we've yet to discover. So there is, a lot of complexity, which also opens service providers up to a lot of opportunity as partners to come in and say, look, we can help you navigate that, complex chessboard of moves. But I think at the moment, that's kind of frankly where we are. There's a lot of overwhelming opportunity, but not enough specific pain point use cases for industries.
Great observation. We have called the webinar Deconstructing Agentic AI for a reason. So if you break that down, so what's the advice? And don't mean so much the oversimplifying advice, all about data management, garbage in, garbage out. I think people have got that message broadly speaking. But I think if I look at the big issue, almost you pointed it out, I think it's all about how we can help organizations to scale. And I think the big issue is to address integration, especially around data, not just data, but again, back to technology debt, process debt, cultural debt. But then the bigger one for me is governance. And governance,
Yeah.
it's not one, when we talk to many of the supply side community, often you get, yes, then we figured it out. Either we put some of guidelines on ethics on our websites where I'm just shaking my head and say, guys, you haven't understood my question or what you have to do. Or the other way around, literally saying, what are the issues from a technology point of view? Is there model drift? How can we measure that? In the end, it's outsourcing 101. You are responsible for the outcome you're delivering. That thing we find quite easily also in our conversations. At times, when you get stares, I'm used to getting stared at, so let's park that for a moment. But beyond those issues, I think if people don't want to address those issues, then that you have to literally assure an outcome. Probably we are not mature enough to even deploy it in an enterprise context. And what we have seen, most use cases, the consumer use cases anyway, especially with generative, probably more than agentic. Agentic, we haven't seen that many demos, if we're honest, especially not compliance, internally loads. But
Absolutely.
so coming back to my question, and my long-winded, sorry for that question. So what's the advice? Well, how should the buyer side think about that? What are good first steps?
I mean, look, I touched on it a little bit earlier, so I'll come back to it. It's like, a good first step is, sit down. An agentic AI strategy is really, or an AI driven strategy is more a conversation of, what parts of my organization am I running where actually labor arbitrage is part of the conversation at the moment, or where there's not enough staff and over. So what we're looking at here is build that right strategy. And as I said, look for the build that strategy where it doesn't have to be turning on the switch today. It's not a technology conversation. Yeah, and the reason why also most organizations shouldn't be in a rush to make these decisions is because of the stuff we discussed to do with the governance side of things as well. There's also new roles where you start. There's also new roles in relation to this conversation now. So ensuring that the output of these autonomous decision making are as ethical as possible. There's new governance relations to that. There's roles around ethicists, as I always tongue twist myself around when I say that. But these are new roles that are being talked about, but I'm also not seeing adopted in earnest yet. And I think we'll probably go through that whole sort of cycle of a few cases where there's a lot of disappointment. I mean, there is obviously design patterns for effective implementation on a technical level already appearing. And that would be part of what a buyer should be looking at as well if I was back in an architecture side of roles. However, though, what we're not seeing necessarily is a pattern from a business adoption perspective. So they're patterns, for example, like AutoGen by Microsoft, and things like LangGraph and things like. So there's technical patterns, but not necessarily business adoption level style sort of patterns on that side of things yet. So there's still some early days on those first early steps. And then, as you said as well about governance, and governance is obviously a part of it. There's testing, monitoring as well as part of this, and then again coming back with my best sort of football manager cliche sort of thing is this is an evolutionary, not a revolutionary type cycle. If you look at the industry as a whole, we're talking about it as a revolutionary thing. It's going to revolutionize how we work as an organization and business. When you're building that strategy in your organization, you need to work out, what's the evolutionary steps for your parts of your business. So what are the goal drivers? And frankly, the goal drivers for autonomous decision making is 9 times out of 10, to drive some level of efficiency or to drive some level of scale. So if you can't have a compelling idea about that, you're not going to get a compelling use case. And the other side of it is, more often than not, organizations struggle with the cost of removing existing complexity out of their organization and replacing it with something new. They also struggle with the idea of challenging themselves in the face of something like agentic AI with deciding whether they should fundamentally restructure their business workflows and operating models. You tend to see a lot of layering on top of existing behaviors, which means you get some advantage, but you don't get the whole advantage of the technology. And a lot of organizations are not bold enough to do that. So when you said we've been doing cloud for years, that's partly because people have been getting bolder over time. It's not straight out the gate, but I hope that helps.
Great point. I'm just staring at the Q&A, and guys,
Ah,
don't easier. Please make use of the Q&A section. I'm looking at the chat section as well. I'm a guy, I can't multitask, so I'm gonna keep it simple for me. Use the Q&A section. There's a couple of questions coming in, Spencer. Some of them are, do you feel the technology already has a maturity for large enterprise deployment? Or if not, when do you see that? That was a bit of a crystal ball question.
I mean, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that as well. I mean, look, on my side of things, I think this is no different to a lot of prior technologies with regards to, if you look at the majority of organizations that I speak and work with and have worked for, adoption tends to come passively a lot. So now I say that whilst knowing that all the big ecosystem players are selling a, hey, look at a separate agentic AI license on the side for a second. But in the same way that a lot of organizations, were thinking, oh, how much cloud do I adopt? And then you would ask them, well, do you use this? Do you use Salesforce? Do you use ServiceNow? They're, oh, yeah, I do. Well, you're already using cloud. The agentic conversation is going to be very similar. Most organizations I speak with, would you believe it, non-IT people, don't realize how much AI is already being used in their business through these ecosystems. Anytime you're typing something in and a recommendation box comes in, machine learning. So there's going to be a lot of passive acceleration of agentic AI. Now, so that's not the challenge. The challenge is getting the more sophisticated full value use of it, which you talked about, a few minutes ago, Tom, which is that deeper business change. That's the maturity curve in organizations. We'll definitely see adoption over the next few years. It's not like we've got to wait a few years for it's going to happen, but it's going to happen through the sort of the lower hanging fruit workloads first. Like I said, ServiceNow in using it for the CSM side of things. People like Genesis and a contact center using it to support. There's a lot of very obvious target. Adobe for content creation, again being built in their ecosystem by the ecosystem creator, so they know what they're doing. There'll be a lot of early adoption around that because that's just natural. It's that more complicated level that's going to take a few years for comfort to build and trust to really come into.
I agree, but I think also I can't help thinking, and it's not almost typical analyst answer, it depends, but the other way around. I think what actually are the goals we're trying to achieve? And I think
Yeah.
where a lot of the discussions, I think it reminds me of the automation discussion, because we started to discuss at least the ambition, the goal of end-to-end automation, if you could recall all the discussion of RPA and what came after RPA. And I think we are in a similar stage. We're starting to almost, and much of agentic has a connotation of end-to-end, and then also looking at the question of literally fundamentally replacing large part of human interaction. But I'm saying that if we take that connotation end-to-end,
Yep.
I don't think we are even close, quite frankly,
Can
because
I, can I
all the issues we called out from technology debt, but even the ambition and how to drive that change, if two-thirds of cloud transformation haven't achieved their strategic objectives fully, how on earth come on the next step, cloud data and AI?
No, I mean, and I think you just open up a good Pandora's box there. So in two respects. So I'll be very blunt and open about something like RPA for me for many years was a dead man walking technology because it was quite limited. It did, it did a lot at first, but what it had for a lot of organizations was they RPA'd every join point in their organization. And then at the time, this is years ago, I mean, the technology has evolved now, but at that point, they'd RPA'd so many things where it became fragile and rigid in the sense that if something changed on either side of the RPA instance, it broke the RPA robot at the time. Now, at least the self-healing has come along and has changed. But the point I'm trying to make here is we haven't got to the point yet where organizations fully understand where the frailty is around agentic AI. Where will it, where's its breaking point? And then we're already in this excited phase in the tech side of things, talking about multi-agents and stuff. Well, you've got potential dangers around things like that as a technology perspective, where without the human in the loop, if the human's only at the start, say, of a journey and at the end, and a set of decision making and autonomy happens between multiple agents in the middle, you know, we don't know yet what happens if these agents start to make bad decisions and then creates a ripple effect across multiple agents. What happens if somebody is able to affect the behavior of one of those agents? So there's a lot of early stage unknowns and a lot of risks at the moment. But then again, a lot of companies like Microsoft and others are very tightly focusing on certain specific value in the coding world and stuff like that, and around for testing tools and stuff. So it's very typical. We're in that very typical phase. There's going to be some mistakes made. We're going to see some stories on the register and places like that of massive mistakes and people getting very angry with people. But that's the nature of humans while we're still involved, of course, before AI takes all our jobs. But that's the nature of humans and nature of deployments.
That's talking of RPA, and you remind me I'm a failed historian, so I've spent far too much time on RPA. And in the previous life, probably would have called a lipstick on a pig, but working for a European organization like PSC, probably have to change my language slightly. Spencer,
I love that.
to close it out, Spencer, I think one question perhaps help people to get a sense a little bit again, navigating where we really are. The question is, where do you see almost the adoption at the moment? Is this more IT centric and a strong connotation? It's more around machine than actually humans, or it's the other way around, more around business process centric requirement where you have so much more human interaction?
Yeah, no, I think I mean, again, I always good to hear yours as well, but I think that's a really lovely question. This for me is the first time in my career where I'm seeing early adoption conversations not being an IT-led conversation. And for whatever we might bemoan the impact of generative AI and ChatGPT on the world, what that did was raise the awareness of these type of AI technologies as they grow now to a level of people and to a range of people it hadn't previously. So when I speak with most organizations now, they're already comfortably looking at, okay, what parts, what business functions. So CMOs, or like I say, in the Adobe ecosystem, already looking at it for content creation, managing content supply chain type activities, stuff like this. Salesforce in the same as well around the not so much in the commerce side of things, but in the CRM and then in other parts of their side of things. So, but where I'm seeing most conversation outside of the sort of some real hardcore tech use cases in certain industries is much more through the big ecosystem companies.
Great advice. Unfortunately, looking at the time, we could go on, and we have great questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Great discussion. I love your questions. We will try to get back to those after the session, but also let us know some of them you felt was this the right level of interaction and insights we provided you. What are the topics we should tackle next? Because as you could tell, if nothing else, both Spencer and I are passionate like it, but also I think we feel we have to, again, literally coming back to the introduction, we have to cut through the marketing noise and be relevant to a broader set of stakeholders. So we're not negative, we're not suggesting agentic AI or any permutation of AI is not happening. It's the other way around. What can we learn from, for instance, from other secular technologies? We've been there with cloud, with automation. And I think that's probably the way as analysts, unless we're literally just regurgitating what some of the supply side is telling us, but I don't think there's much value in that. So do let us know. Don't know, what's the right level of conversation? Did you get any value out of that? But also, what are the other topics you would like us to tackle? With that, big thank you to my esteemed colleague, Spencer. But more importantly, guys, we really appreciate your time. Look forward to driving that discussion with all of you out there. Thanks so much. Talk soon.
Absolutely. Cheers.